Hi everybody, welcome to probably the most important episode from this series of coming back to the sacred nature of birth. Welcome to the episode on medicalization of birth, and it's gonna be an episode. I think it's gonna be surprising for you and maybe shocking at times. I did a lot of research on my own last year. I've been reading many books. I've been speaking with different people who are in the birthing field. I don't say it is exclusive and everything is here, but it is my line of narrative that makes sense to many people, and it makes sense, and it is a connection to other sources that I found. And I just think it should be essential for us to understand it really, and especially for us as women, we should raise these questions to our minds, like why do we need midwives? There is a beautiful book of Michelle O'Donnell, which is titled "Do We Need Midwives?" It is important to have these questions. Do we need a midwife? Why do we need a midwife? Do we need this procedure or that procedure, and why do we need it? Where does it come from? Does it have medical explanation? Does it have research that supports its use? Because many times we come across in the field of birth, we come across procedures that are just based on habit, not really on any medical explanation. So welcome to this episode, and stay with me. It's gonna be a bit longer, slightly longer than the other ones. I will try to make it as short, as simple as I can. So firstly, I was trying to get to know how did the birth look like originally. And many indigenous tribes, even until today, they show traits of completely lonely birth, completely independent birth, where it is the woman that is giving the birth alone. And there are some tribes that are birthing in the jungle, in the forest. Some of them give birth close to the rivers, and usually it is there is this tendency of a woman getting further from the village and giving birth alone. So sometimes there is her mother, but in most of the tribes it is her partner who is accompanying her, but rather than helping her and supporting her through the process, he is just protecting the area around and sometimes providing her with food or water. And so I took it as our origin, as nature designed us. So exactly as other mammals, we are getting further from the group, we are getting further from the tribe, we are birthing, we are protected by one person, and then we are coming back after the whole process. And when I was asking myself the question, so when it started, when I was researching, when I was reading books, so I was asking myself question, when did we start to actually birth in accompanied by other women? And the switch was somewhere around the Neolithic revolution, when we changed from the hunter-gatherer communities to more sedentary lifestyle. So what happened then, it was that humans started to colonize territories that were more difficult, were more demanding when it comes to climate, and probably women, and not only women, probably just all of the humans started to struggle to show some signs of vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So probably there were some problems with the birth that started to appear because of these deficiencies, because of these difficulties with acclimatization. And probably this was the time when the so-called intuitive midwifery started to be practiced by women. So already in antiquity we have signs of this kind of midwifery, and also in Middle Ages there are some records of women accompanying birthing women. But then what happened in Middle Ages is that the religion started to push it out. So the first records on births in 17th century mentioned about the laying position, you know, the lithotomy position, which is the woman is laying on her back. And it was because of the kings. It was for the kings to be able to observe the whole process of childbirth, and thus the childbirth became some kind of a spectacle, some kind of a display in royal courts. And this position on the back was just helping, you know, it was just allowing for the better view, and also it was allowing the women accompanying the birthing woman, the mother, to access her womb, really. But with this laying down position, with this lithotomy position, we start to see some mentions about problems, birthing problems. And in the 17th century, the Chamberlain family in France invented obstetric forceps. So it was the first tool that was invented in the birth field. And in the beginning, it was really brutal, and it was really like a kind of an experiment on women, even though the intention was to help them, right? Because there are some records in history of births that stopped, of the births that were obstructed, that the births that were being prolonged. So yes, there was an invention of helping the woman, but it was in the beginning. I found information that was made with a lot of brutal. It was really brutal. You know, they entered women's homes with a closed box, and laboring women were covered with blankets so they wouldn't know what was happening. The tool sometimes saved the baby, but very often also caused fatal bleedings or permanent damage to the baby or the mother. So this was the time of the first tools, and also the men midwives slowly pushed out completely the traditional women midwifery. So Michel Audin wrote in his books about the male obsession with controlling birth and the role of technology as a disruptor of physiology. A social consequence was that when forceps became a male competency, female midwives were marginalized. So the intimate connection with the laboring woman was replaced with a model in which the doctor dictated positions and interventions. And then another important chapter in the history of midwifery is the 19th century, when James Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, conducted surgical experiments on enslaved black women all of them were done without anesthesia. So this is a very brutal part of modern medicine history. I'm not gonna get too much into it. You can read about it. It's really terrible to see. There are also some pictures on it. He claimed that black women didn't feel the pain the same way as white women did, and of course it was the time of slavery. But still, if we think about it, that most of the practices and procedures in our times are based on this origin, it is quite, I don't know if it's the right word in English, but it's a bit crippling. It's quite terrifying. So at the same time, thousands of women were dying from postpartum infections in European hospitals because there was no knowledge of antisepsis. So there was no knowledge about bacteria, infections, and the doctors were simply, going from autopsies from the autopsy rooms directly to birthing women without washing their hands. So there was a doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered the link between hygiene and mortality, but initially he was mocked and dismissed from the profession. So at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, pharmacological anesthesia was introduced, including twilight sleep, which was a mix of morphine and scopolamine, and it meant to make women forget the pain. In reality, women screamed and had to be tied to bed so they wouldn't disturb doctors. So there was a lot of experiments involved in the process of really trying to manage the disturbances of the obstruction of the birth process and the consequences of disturbing the birth process. And in my opinion, we see it until today, that we just try to manage and micromanage the effect, the consequences of disturbing the natural process of birth. During this period, so 19th, 20th century, pelvic X-rays were also used to assess whether a woman was fit for vaginal birth, and these babies were later found to have a body deformation and increased cancer risks due to radiation exposure. And other experiments. From the 1940s to the 1970s, pregnant women were given DES, which is a synthetic estrogen, to prevent miscarriages. And hundreds of thousands of children, and mostly girls, were born with uterine malformations, infertility, and cancer. And so in the second half of the 20th century, hospitals implemented routine episiotomies and mass cesarean sections. Birth became almost fully medicalized. Women, it's a simplification, but this is what's happening. They lost connection with their own power. They gave birth in a haste, under surveillance, without choice or voice. And only in the 80s and 90s, there was a kind of a wave of resistance that began. Movements for home births, water births, partly thanks to Michel Audin, who was a big advocate for natural birth. So he was the one who supporting water births in hospitals. First birth centers started to appear, and return to midwifery and doulas was registered. So yes, we see more and more that the psychological and spiritual dimensions of birth are starting to be introduced to the hospitals, but it's still very fragmented, and sometimes it is not really possible to connect it with the highly medicalized procedures and tendencies that still run the system. And I know it from the inside out, from many doulas or lactation consultants, that they say that there is sometimes no work possible to be done with women who suffered such traumatic and disturbed births, that even though they are present in the hospital, but they see that they are like a painkiller instead of working on the level of the origin of all this pain and the reason of all this pain, which is obstruction of the natural birthing process. Another thing that is also important, if you're listening to me from US, and for sure you know about it, that is in many countries especially in Latin America, there was the concept of obstetric violence introduced to the legal codes, and it is a big issue in United States, where women of color present a much higher mortality rate in birth. So what I would suggest is, let's all zoom out and let's see from the beginning what was the first intervention in the birth process. The first intervention was us getting further from the nature. So what we can assume is that the solution is to get closer to the nature, which is better hydration, better diet for the pregnant women. But this is something obvious, and we are now living on such a high level of life. Yes, we do experience the toxicity of our environment, but this all can be managed, and we can, with consciousness and awareness, we can drastically reduce the effect of us being far from the nature. But another part of it is also enjoyment, entertainment, I can say. Treating women just, lower, undermining women. And I'm talking here about childbirth as a spectacle, as a form of royal court display. And if we think about it, that this is the beginning of all the problems, of most of the problems, and most of the techniques that were after developed to manage these problems. So how can we solve this? By returning women to the center of childbirth, to returning women to the center of their power, by bringing back their sovereignty, really, in the whole process. And this is the context in which I decided to work with pregnant women. And I understood that after 5 years of working somatically with women on different topics, on body acceptance. I work with a lot of women who suffered from eating disorders, or who suffered from intimacy issues, from pain during sex, and endometriosis and other feminine diseases. And then when I experienced the labor myself, I understood that this is the gold mine. This is where it all began. This is how we get the codes of what the woman is. When we are born from the woman, we understand what a woman is, what kind of source of power the woman is, if it is allowed to be the source of power. And then we experience a mother who is a powerful woman, if we allow her, and if she's conscious and aware enough to experience her, her femininity and her womanhood in a sacred way. So this is all. That's the end of this series on birth medicalization, and I hope this was a solid, something solid that you can base all my further content on. And even though it's not easy for me to recall all of these brutal facts, I find it essential in understanding why this work is so important, why it is so important for us to come back to the sacred nature of birth, and why is it so important for women to do the work. Thank you so much for your attention, for being with me. See you in the next videos. Bye.